Welcome to part 3 of the Blackstone Intelligence series on Freemasonry. Secret societies, including Freemasonry, have played and are continuing to play significant roles in our world. There are a lot of people on YouTube who mention the Freemasons in offhanded ways, without really going into any depth about who they are, what they believe, and I could certainly do the same. I think I'm probably creative enough to come up with something sensational and spooky to tickle the ears of anyone who likes a good mystery, but I'm trying to do more than that with this series. My goal in talking about Freemasonry is to give you all an accurate understanding of how Freemasonry evolved, including providing you with a thorough explanation of Masonic beliefs. That way, when you hear Freemasonry mentioned in other circles or on other channels, you'll have a much more rich understanding of the topic than those who just kind of gloss over the subject and simply refer to Freemasonry without actually knowing what they're talking about. So this means that you've got to sit through some history lessons. And trust me, I do empathize with those of you who are not big history buffs. Believe it or not, before I discovered my own love for history, I flunked world history in high school. And then I flunked it twice in college, and that was before I dropped out of school. Years later, and when I went back to try again, my attitude toward learning had evolved, and I ended up actually majoring in history because I loved it. So I had learned that to understand the world around us today, we have to understand the lessons of the past, because history is a repeating cycle. So to properly understand Freemasonry today, we have to understand not only Freemasonry from the past, but also the systems and the schools of thought from which it sprang. And so in this video, we are going to dive into the history of the Roman Empire. First, I'll talk about the empire itself, then how it persecuted Christians, and then how it embraced Christianity and basically took control of it for a while. And as much as some of you hate any mention of the subject of Christianity, it's simply impossible to understand the development of Freemasonry without looking at the development of the early Christian church. All right, let's start here. The Roman Empire was one of the greatest civilizations in history. Rome took its name from its founder Romulus, who was the first of 7 Roman kings. In 509 BC, the last king was expelled and a constitutional republic was established, complete with a Roman Senate. Centuries later, when Rome fell into civil war and Julius Caesar emerged as the supreme dictator, this was around 49 BC, the Roman Republic essentially came to an end. With no children of his own, Julius Caesar had adopted his grandnephew Octavius, or Octavian, and named him as his heir. Octavius was a statesman as well as a political leader. So when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Octavius rose to power. He went on to consolidate even more political power. And most historians place the beginning of the Roman Empire at 27 BC, when Octavius gave himself the title of Augustus, which means emperor. The Roman Empire was unprecedented in size. It controlled over 2 million miles of territory, stretching from Britain in the west to modern-day Turkey in the east, and in the north from the Rhine River all the way down to its southern territories along North Africa. Some years later, in 64 AD, Rome was set ablaze, and then Emperor Nero blamed the arson on the small but growing population of new Christian converts. And I'm sure you've all heard the stories of Christians being thrown to the lions in sporting arenas. But Roman attitudes toward Christianity changed a lot in 306 AD. And that's when Constantine became the new emperor, and he declared Rome to be a Christian empire. And from that point on, Catholicism became enmeshed with state political power. So in 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I proclaimed that Christianity was to be the sole religion of the Roman Empire, and just 15 years later, he made another major change. See, the Roman Empire had simply grown too vast for a single government to manage effectively. The affairs of the Western Greek and Latin-speaking Romans were completely different and disconnected from the affairs of the Egyptians and the Jews and the Greeks who were in the East. And of course, the borders of the empire were under constant assault. It was just too sprawling. It was too complex for one government to manage. So Theodosius made the fateful decision to split the empire into two empires under the control of two of his sons. The capital of the Western Roman Empire remained in Rome, and the capital of the Eastern Empire was located in Constantinople, which is actually modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. But the ongoing assaults of barbarians, such as the Visigoths and the Vandals, continued to hack away at the western borders until in 410 AD, Rome was conquered for the first time in over 1,000 years. And then it fell again in 455 AD. And historians generally place the completion of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West at around 476 AD. Now, the Roman Empire in the East continued for nearly a millennium longer, until it eventually fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. And historians now refer to this Eastern Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire. But there's yet one more important distinction about the Roman Empire that we have to make. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, Europe plunged into a period of severe decline. The erosion of literacy and trade, the arts, communication, knowledge in general among the peoples of this former empire. That is known to us as the Dark Ages. And during these centuries, a Germanic people known as the Franks conquered territory inside that former Western Roman Empire that today corresponds to Western Germany, Belgium, and France. And that territory was called the Frankish Empire. And a famous king named Charlemagne took the throne. He formed an alliance with the Catholic Pope, and together they conspired to resurrect the Roman Empire by merging political and religious hierarchical powers together. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as the emperor of the new Holy Roman Empire. Now, 1,000 years later, a French philosopher you may have heard of, Voltaire, he wrote that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It's true that the ambitions of Charlemagne to reconquer the lands of the former Western Roman Empire, they never really came to fruition. And given the corruption of the church, it would be inaccurate, I think, to call this empire holy. But despite ongoing internal feuds between rival princes and the ongoing intrigues of wicked bishops, as well as the constant external threat of pillaging by Viking raiders, this Holy Roman Empire did manage to hold on to power in that region for 1,000 years. Ultimately, the last vestiges of this empire were swept away by a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806. Now, with that whirlwind introduction to the empires of Rome, we can now start to examine how Freemasonry came about during this millennium and how its rise was actually influenced by early Christians. As the original Roman Empire started to expand, the dominant culture throughout the region was Greek culture, which is called Hellenic culture. And the Romans had a deep, deep love of this Greek Enlightenment and continued the spread of Hellenism throughout all of its territories. Rome itself adopted a lot of the cultural practices and belief systems of the Greeks. They even adopted Greek as the official language of the empire, along with Latin. Even many Jews spoke Greek. Given that the disciples of Jesus, who originally wrote the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote their texts in Greek, it's likely that Jesus himself was familiar with Greek, in addition to Hebrew and Aramaic. Paul himself, who was a Roman citizen, was known for expanding the effort to gain Christian converts outside of the land of Palestine into Gentile nations. And by Gentile, that means non-Jewish. Paul spent considerable time in Asia Minor, what we today call Turkey, and he spent time in Greece as well as in Rome itself. And at first, he focused on teaching Jewish communities outside of Palestine, which was something that a lot of these Jewish leaders found incredibly sacrilegious. In fact, in ancient Antioch, which is today located in Turkey, Paul was attacked by the Jewish locals. They stoned him to the brink of death. These angry Jews actually thought he was dead, and they dragged his apparently lifeless body out of the city and left him in the dirt. Well, Paul recovered, and over a period of 3 decades, he traveled throughout the lands of the Roman Empire, going as far as Spain to strengthen existing congregations of Christians and to start new ones. So as the texts themselves verify, there was some disagreement over doctrine and theology among these early Christians. We've got Paul, who had never met Jesus during his mortal ministry. He sometimes clashed with other early leaders, including the chief apostle Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, who was the head of the church in Jerusalem. The primary points of their conflict really revolved around whether or not the followers of Jesus needed to continue to obey traditional Jewish religious laws and customs. One of the prominent Jewish Christian groups that clashed with Paul over points of doctrine were called the Ebionites. They had actually sprung from the sect called the Essenes. The conflict between Pauline and Ebionite beliefs came to a swift end around the time that the Christian community in Jerusalem was decimated. If we look at what multiple ancient historians wrote, the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, Ananus ben Ananus, ordered the execution of James. They stoned him with rocks, they clubbed him in the head, and then the Jewish scribes and Pharisees took him up to what is known as the pinnacle of the temple, and they threw him off of it to his death. This pinnacle is actually part of the southwestern wall that surrounded the mountain on which the temple stood. That's why it's called the Temple Mount. And at that time, the drop from this point to the ground below was about 450 feet, about 30 to 40 stories. So this spot is notable also from the story of Jesus being tempted by Satan to throw himself off of the pinnacle of the temple and prove his divinity by allowing himself to be saved by angels. Well, anyway, the year after Jesus' brother James was thrown off this pinnacle, the Roman Empire responded to a rebellion in Jerusalem by annihilating the city in 70 AD. They purged it of its inhabitants, they destroyed the temple, not leaving one stone left upon another, and this ended any significant Jewish presence in Jerusalem for about 2,000 years. This was the primary event that sent the Ebionite sect into exile. We'll come back to them in the later on. Despite the collapse of the Ebionite congregations around Jerusalem, we have Pauline Christianity that actually increased throughout the Gentile world. And as these early converts began to spread in number, they came under persecution by people who viewed them with suspicion, the Romans. And they became an easy scapegoat for virtually any crime. So it was no surprise that in 64 AD, this embattled Roman emperor, Nero, blamed the burning of Rome on the Christians. And shortly thereafter, by the way, Nero condemned both Paul and Peter to death. Paul was killed by beheading, and Peter was crucified. And persecutions of these early Christians went on to become very widespread. It forced them underground. Some of them formed their own secret networks, complete with signs and passwords. And one of the most well-known of these symbols you guys have seen, it was the symbol of the fish, or the ichthus. While the symbol had, of course, spiritual significance to Christian converts, it was also widely used by Greeks and Romans and pagans, so they could use it a lot without notice. They used the symbol to mark like secret meeting places, and it is said that these Christians, when they wanted to identify each other safely, one would stoop on the ground and draw an arched line on the ground. And if the other person was also a Christian, he would know how to respond by drawing the form of the outline of the fish underneath. If the guy didn't respond, the Christian would know not to reveal himself. But this kind of Roman persecution of Christians eventually took on a new form. After Constantine made Christianity the religion of the entire empire, most Christians found safety, but not all of them. In fact, it was the Catholic Church itself that took over persecution of some of these Christian sects, most notably the Gnostics. Christian Gnostics were Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries whose religious belief systems were very heavily influenced by Hellenistic period mystery cults. And a faction of these Gnostics were to play very significant roles in the development of Freemasonry. So in my next episode, I will take you deep into the world of Gnostic philosophy and how a group of families claiming descent from Jewish high priests combined Jewish mysticism with earlier teachings of Egyptian and Greek mystery schools to develop some of the most esoteric secrets of the Masonic order. So watch for that episode tomorrow. For Blackstone Intelligence, I'm Jake Morphonios.